Hi everyone, nice to see you back on the channel again. Thanks for coming by. Today I am going to talk about, my belief that if you are an adult or if you're into your late teens, certainly, then learning a language, a foreign language, is the ultimate cognitive endeavor. What I mean by that is that learning a language is, especially if it's a fairly alien language, especially if it's a language that's quite unlike your own native language, is the most generally challenging and taxing thing that you can choose to do as an adult human being. If you're 6 years old, obviously it's going to be something quite different, but if you're 6 years old, you're probably not watching this video anyway, and it won't apply to you. I think in the US military they talk about full spectrum dominance, which is a very sort of US military way of referring to excuse me, a state of affairs in which you are dominant in all conceivable military, war, combat type situations. I didn't put that very well, but it means your navy is better than your opponent's navy, your army, your ground forces more generally are better than theirs. It means that your air force is better than theirs. It means that your surveillance capabilities are better than theirs. Your intelligence is better than theirs. Your satellites up in space with nuclear rockets loaded into them are better than your enemies. You're superior everywhere. Well, learning a foreign language is what I would call a full spectrum cognitive and emotional challenge. Let's put it like that. And that is what I'd like to touch on. That's what I'd like to explain in more detail today. Provisionally, I've split this up into 5 different categories. Maybe I'll think of more as I go along, but we'll see how it goes. The first category of difficulty, the first way in which studying foreign languages or learning foreign languages is challenging, is conceptual. When you learn a foreign language, you have to learn to express yourself again from scratch. Now, I'm not talking here about a Spanish speaker learning Portuguese or a Russian learning Ukrainian. Not very likely at the moment, but let's ignore that. I'm not talking about that sort of thing. I'm talking about a situation in which you have to basically learn more or less from the ground up a grammar that is sufficiently alien that your own intuitions don't make any particular sense when you try to use that grammar. There's a sliding scale between familiar languages or related languages and alien languages, but when you have to deal with a significant amount of structural and grammatical alienness, your brain is going to be called upon to do some of the most difficult things that an adult human being can try and do. There are things that a 5 or 6 year old child can do basically effortlessly in their own language that many years of dedicated study will not allow at least some adults to do when they try and learn those languages as an adult. To give you one example, you're probably a native speaker of English if you're watching this video. If you are, you might not appreciate how difficult it is to use articles correctly in English. I have many Russian-speaking students, some of them perfectly intelligent and accomplished people, some of them who speak English quite well already, but who nonetheless have terrible difficulty understanding how to use articles in English. It is quite frightening to see how difficult this can be. It's quite frightening to see what a horrific conceptual puzzle it can be, this question of the correct use of articles. Many people are hopelessly at sea with this stuff, even after many years of study. And this is one challenge amongst hundreds, if not thousands, of challenges that exist when we try and learn a foreign language. I don't want to trivialize mathematics, but in maths, if you're not doing original research in maths there's usually a correct way, at least one correct way of solving the problem that you're trying to solve, and there's someone who can tell you how to do it and who can show you all the individual steps along the way. Languages, or grammar in particular, structural considerations in languages are so slippery, so complex, so difficult to pin down, so difficult to map out, that there is no map, there is no algorithm. It's much more slippery than that. Human language and computer languages are very different to each other. And this is the first and arguably the biggest challenge in learning a foreign language. The second way in which foreign language learning is the ultimate cognitive stroke emotional endeavour is that it will create situations that are emotionally very difficult and very taxing. When you have essentially lost the ability to speak and to understand spoken language, and I'm going to ignore reading and writing here because speaking and listening are more than enough to make my point. When you end up in a situation in which you cannot speak and cannot understand what is said to you, you've been stripped of one of the most basic competences, one of the most basic skill sets of any psychologically normal human being. And that creates a situation that can be very, very unpleasant to deal with. When you try and speak a foreign language, when you try and interact in a foreign language, this will depend, of course, on your personality type, but you will often find that there is a constant string of minor humiliations and sometimes major humiliations along the way. And dealing with the emotional challenges involved in that can be quite trying at times. It's not easy to pick yourself back up when you've just made a complete idiot of yourself for the 7th time in a period of 30 minutes. It's quite unpleasant, and it's unpleasant in a way that will generally not be familiar to us. If you try and do something that is obviously difficult, like play a musical instrument, I mean, that's something that's quite hard on the whole, right? Playing a musical instrument. If you try and learn to do that and you experience difficulty, then you are experiencing the same type of difficulty that everyone will experience with that to a greater or lesser extent. But when you are trying to speak a foreign language and you're basically mucking it up, you're experiencing a difficulty that is not felt, not experienced by the native speakers of the language. I'm not saying that children learn languages without effort, but by the time you've grown up, you don't remember any of the effort that was involved in learning a native language. It just seems to flow out of you. And when we perceive that in the natives and perceive our lack of ability to do that in ourselves, the difference and the struggles that difference creates for us can be very humiliating and disturbing. And this is something that is not stressed enough in all of this feel-good blether we hear about language learning on the internet. Emotionally, it can be very taxing, learning foreign languages. This is related in some sense to the previous point, but you need an awful lot of discipline to learn foreign language as well. There is a long delay between the first step in this journey and at that point in time at which you start to feel comfortable in the language. And there's a long time between that point in time when you start to feel comfortable and that point in time when you start to feel really comfortable. It takes a long time. There's a terrible lag in foreign language learning. You can study, especially if it's an alien language, you can study it quite hard for quite a long time and still be so bad at it that you can barely interact in it at all. It takes a lot of discipline. You've got to know where you're going, and you've got to know why you're going there, and you have to have some idea how much effort and time and perhaps money are going to be involved. It takes a lot of discipline to get good. The fourth obvious thing that makes foreign language learning a major cognitive endeavour is pronunciation. People argue, of course, about the extent to which we retain the ability to learn foreign languages as we get older, but it is intuitively, I think, fairly obvious that our ability to pronounce them well is something that deteriorates relatively quickly. It deteriorates quickly enough that when we encounter people who can acquire genuinely native-like pronunciation in a foreign language that they started learning as an adult, we are surprised by it. I am always very impressed by people who can acquire genuinely native-like pronunciation in a foreign language at an advanced age. It doesn't have to be that advanced, even 20 counts as advanced in this context. We can't hear the things that we used to be able to hear. The small phonetic and phonological distinctions that we could pick up on easily as children, we can't do that anymore. Sometimes there are major and important distinctions that we cannot pick up on or hear at all. That's the perceptual side of things. Of course, there are also tremendous articulatory problems. Some sounds are notoriously difficult, like the trilled r in Spanish. But even when you're not dealing with notoriously difficult sounds, whatever foreign language you learn, it will present you with serious articulatory difficulties, especially if you're trying to speak at a natural speed. So you have a whole suite here of related problems that are very, very demanding. And for many of us, our ceiling with respect to these matters is relatively low. By which I mean, no matter how much we may try, we can never come to be particularly good at these things. And that creates another emotional difficulty, going back to the problems I was mentioning earlier. Some people don't care about their pronunciation very much when they learn foreign languages. I think that's a horrible mistake. I think that's a sign of real ignorance, to be blunt. But if you do care and you realize that you sound like a bit of a plonker sometimes, then that too is an unpleasant and undermining situation. And that one it's hard to get around that. It's hard to solve that problem. If you're not favored in this regard, then you might find yourself in a situation in which you always sound a bit daft and weird. And knowing that is not very pleasant. The fifth factor is memory. The sheer amount of work that is involved in memorizing, most obviously words, perhaps their spellings. If you're dealing with languages like Japanese or Chinese, then of course you're not even talking about spelling anymore. You're talking about a logographic or somewhat logographic writing system that uses Chinese characters. Japanese uses Chinese characters and other characters, so it's a bit of a hybrid case. But there's a huge amount of memorization involved in learning a foreign language. And some of that memorization applies to what we might consider to be grammar. You know, irregular verbs, you have to learn these irregular conjugations. English has a certain amount of that kind of stuff. And although that's grammar, and learning grammar is usually not about brute memorization, but sometimes it is. If you're learning English and you want to learn to ask questions properly in English, then sometimes you have to use the auxiliary verb to do. He lives here. Where does he live? Right, you have to use the auxiliary verb to do to ask that question. You can memorize where to use it and where not to use it, but the rules are much more complex than you might expect them to be. If you've never thought about it, you would probably be surprised. It's quite nasty, and even reasonably decent speakers of English continue to make mistakes with this kind of thing. There's a huge amount of memorization, and that too is a massive challenge. And this sort of thing explains why the failure rate in language learning is so high. Again, even with languages that are relatively accessible to native speakers of English, Spanish, German, etc., the failure rate is going to be extremely high. And when you move to Japanese, Arabic, etc., then it doesn't take any great degree of brain power to understand why so many people crash and burn. That is why I say that foreign language learning is indeed the ultimate cognitive, emotional undertaking, challenge, endeavour for adult human beings. If you think I'm talking rubbish, feel free to let me know in the comments. If you agree with everything I've said, you can let me know about that too. That is it for today. Thanks very much for your attention. I appreciate it, and I will see you next time. Ciao, ciao. Bye-bye.